Does the head covering tradition apply only when the church gathers together, or does it apply elsewhere too? This is the second video I will be addressing on this same question because I received some feedback on the previous one. In the earlier video, I said that explicit references to the gathered church are found in the passage on the Lord's Supper and in chapter 14, which concerns the use of spiritual gifts in church, as in the church service. However, such explicit references to the church gathering, the church assembly, the church service, they are not found in chapter 11 verse 2 to verse 16, which concerns the head covering tradition. These explicit references to the church gathering are only found after this section, after the head covering section. And so I received the feedback from the earlier video that, wait a minute, Paul does mention the church in verse 16. So if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. And so the argument goes that the head covering tradition only applies when we gather in churches on Sunday, in that assembly, in the gathering, in the service, because Paul was referring to a service in verse 16. And so it only applies in the service. It doesn't apply when you pray or prophesy, let's say at home or along the road or in other settings. It doesn't apply. It only applies during the Sunday service setting, because Paul was referring to a church service, a gathering. That's the argument. In response, yes, I agree, the word church appears in verse 16, as you can see. But Paul was not referring to the church service, to a church assembly, to a church gathering. In verse 16, churches of God is a reference to the identity of Christians, not the act, not the action of assembling, not the venue, not the setting of a Sunday service. Paul was not referring to that. You can see this distinction between churches of God as an identity versus coming together as a church. You can see this distinction in chapter 14, verse 33 to 35. As in all the churches of the saints, speaking of identity, the women should keep silent. Where? In the churches, venue, setting. For they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands. Where? At home. See, there's a contrast between speaking in church, in the venue, in the setting of the Sunday service, versus speaking at home. We're talking about the venue or setting. For it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Another reference to church venue, church setting. Pause here because I need to say, for more on these often misunderstood verses, please see the videos on chapter 14, because it's often misunderstood how these verses will apply. But now back to chapter 11 verse 16, where we talked about the churches of God. I hope it's clear that the churches of God, just like the churches of the saints, they are a reference to the identity of Christians. This is not a reference to the action of gathering or assembling in a Sunday service. So verse 16 means, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God, nor do other Christians. It's not referring to the Sunday service. It's referring to who they are. Okay, just one more example. In the verses just before the section on the head covering, Paul wrote in chapter 10, verse 31 and 33, so whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. Who shouldn't you offend? Greeks, Jews, and church of God, and all other Christians. This is talking about identity. just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Once again, here the Church of God is a reference to the identity of Christians, not the action of assembling or gathering in a certain venue or a certain setting. Paul was referring to identity, who not to offend, instead of where not to offend. Right? So we are not to offend unbelieving Jews or Gentiles or fellow Christians, the Church of God. So to be clear, in chapter 11, verse 2 to 16, Paul has not referenced the church gathering or the church assembly or the Sunday service. He has not referenced that venue, that setting. Verse 16's reference to the Church of God is a reference to the identity of God's people, Christians, the Church of God. It is not a reference to the Sunday service. So the head covering tradition for Paul was not connected to the church assembly per se. Rather, Paul connected it to the spiritual acts of praying and prophesying, which can be done outside of your church service. It can be done alone, praying at home. It can be done on the street, anywhere. It doesn't need to be done only in the church service. Therefore, the head covering tradition applies when we pray, sing to God, or prophesy, whenever, wherever, alone, or with whoever. Both when the church comes together and when the church is not together. I hope that makes it clear. And if you have any other feedback, do not hesitate to get in touch at searchingscripture@gmail.com.